Now it should be on.
It's on.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. He doesn't like me as a result. But that's okay. In a sense, I don't feel so bad because it puts me, I think, among a long list of people who she doesn't like. So it's okay.
Yeah, no, I agree.
No. I mean, I think the voices are actually very good. I mean, as I'm saying, as I said, right? We use them because I think they are the best thing available. So in that sense, I think that the stuff that she's done is very nice stuff. I just think that sometimes it's oversold and not as well.
Okay, maybe we should get started. Expecting more people.
It's just one star now, so there's only hope.
I see a few more people. All right, let's get started. Pablo Cerda Duran will tell us about the nature of Magnetar QPOs. Same format as in the past.
Okay.
About an hour talk and with lots of questions that may spill over a little longer.
Okay. So first, I would like to thank the organizer for letting me give this talk today. So I'm going to talk about this Magnetar QPOs. I'm going to explain in a minute what is that. And well, I added this other MSD stuff because after the discussion of yesterday, I thought it would be interesting just to show some of these MRI simulations that I was doing yesterday. Yes, that you know, it's not related to magnetars, but anyway. So this work has been done in collaboration, or all this series of work with people on the MPA, Thessaloniki, and Valencia. Especially Michael Gabler has performed most of the simulations that I'm going to show today. So he's one of the main authors of most of the papers. So this is the outline of my talk. I'm going to start explaining about a bit what are these magnetars and what we observe and what we want to try to explain with the models. And then we go to the different possible models and numerical simulations. And then I will talk a bit about this. About the magnetospheres and the mission and MRI. So the observation. So what are magnetars? Magnetars are strongly magnetized neutron stars. So how do we know that these are strongly magnetized neutron stars? So they appear as anomalous X-ray pulsars or soft gamma repeaters. There is quite an overlap between both. This is just the way they were discovered, but some of them they discovered in one way, but then they are also soft gamma repeaters, so the other way around. So they are slowly rotating and have a rapid spin down. So they are here in the PP dot diagram, which means that they have a spin down inferred magnetic field of 10 to the 14, 10 to 15 Gauss. Just be careful with this number because this is just spin down inferred. So this is an estimation, if you want, of the lower limit of the surface magnetic field, if you want. So it could be much higher than this one, this value, or it could be just this number. So the emission that we see is clearly magnetically powered.
So in one or two cases, wasn't there some other spectral feature that also indicated large fields?
Yes. So there is one case. Maybe you're talking about these low magnetic field magnetars. These are that's why I was telling about this, to be careful with these numbers. So there is one magnetar. So you observe SGR activity, or two, I think. But it has low magnetic field in the sense that the spin down, in the PP dot diagram, it gives you a number of something like 10 to the 12 Gauss. But when you observe more carefully, there are some detections of cyclotron absorption lines which indicate that at the surface it has 10 to the 14 Gauss. That's why I say that this thing is a lower limit, but it may be larger. But at least you should have this number. So it's not like pulsars in which you can, I mean, the luminosity in pulsars is basically, the energetics is basically that of the spin down. In this case, it doesn't fit. So it's not enough the spin down to explain the luminosity. So it's really magnetically powered. So you need a large magnetic field to explain the observation, the X-rays observations. So these objects are neutron stars, and we think that, I mean, among other things, they are everything fits. So they are galactic or nearby. There are some associations with supernova remnants, and well, the progenitor mass is unclear. There are several examples in which there are indications that they may come from massive progenitors, but there are some examples. There is one example also of a magnetar coming from a low mass progenitor. So it's completely unclear what is the progenitor of these objects. So what are these soft gamma repeaters? Soft gamma repeaters are objects which have recurrent gamma ray activity, so they have flashes, and after a while they have another flash, and then it may flash again or never, or, I mean, it's quite variable. So there has been observed 3 giant flares. These are major events, 10 to the 44 to 10 to the 46 ergs per second, and then you have the intermediate flares and small flares, which are very numerous. So these small flares and intermediate flares, you can have flare storms in which in a few days you have hundreds of storms, and then it's quiet for several years, and then it bursts again and things like that. So it's very variable. So the model for these objects, so the current understanding, this Duncan and Thomson model, is that in the neutron star you have continuously stresses built in the crust because of mainly the Hall drift in the crust. So you are continuously twisting the magnetic field in the interior by the movement of the field in the crust, and since all this stress that you are building in the interior is just held by the crust, which is rigid. So at some point you reach the breakage strength of the crust, and the crust breaks in some way, unclear way. But at this point, in principle, you can release all this energy stored in this twist in the interior. You can release it to the magnetosphere and create first a soft gamma ray spike, just associated to the break of the crust, and then all this energy that you put in the magnetosphere, since you have a very intense magnetic field, it will get in a form of a confined, magnetically confined fireball, which accounts for some X-ray emission. So this is the typical luminosity of this event. So you have a hard spike, which is just here. Typically it saturates. This is for one of the giant flares. For the giant flare, it saturates all the instruments. And then this is the fireball, which is contracting. It's evaporating, basically. That's why it has this shape. So it goes down, and it goes down in a finite time, it reaches zero, basically. So that's why we know it's a contracting. I mean, the model is that something which is contracting. What you see, this modulation that you see here is just the rotation of the neutron star. So you can imagine something like this. You have some fireball in one side where the crust broke or whatever, and this is rotating, and you are seeing just that. This modulation is just the rotation of the star.
Is there a parameterized fireball model that can actually fit this curve?
Yes, there are some models. Yes, I mean it's a bit degenerate on the geometry of the ball and things like that, but there are some models on that. Yes. So if you look carefully at each of these periods, I have here some one of these periods. So you see these small wiggles. These things are what we call quasi-periodic oscillations. So if you do an FFT of this thing here.
Sorry, I have one more question. So
Yeah.
you said that these models, the pulse profiles must constrain the geometry of the fireball somehow, right? If it was the whole star, obviously you wouldn't see anything.
Yes.
So do you have an idea of what that constraint is? What fraction? How big can the fireball be?
Okay, so since this thing is not eclipsing, so it's not going to zero, we know that the fireball is larger than the star. So it's not a spot in the star, but it's larger. On the other hand, there are, for example, these QPOs and all these things are phase dependent. So it means that it's really features which are going around. So it's something, the constraint is order of magnitude the size of the star. So something like that, I would say. So it's not a spot and it's not something hundreds of kilometers. It's order of magnitude the size of the star.
Can I just ask you about the saturation? Does it mean that instruments currently cannot tell how big the flare was? Or
I think there is an estimation. I'm not sure if this for this flare or for the other one, based on the reflection on the moon. So I think they got an echo on the moon and they can play some upper limit or something like that. I don't
that's
remember.
How many more? What factor more than what's here?
Sorry.
By what factor is this larger? What?
I cannot remember exactly, but I remember that there is as much total energy in the X-ray tail roughly as in the initial spike. So you have basically same energy in this 0.1 seconds as in the hundreds of
like
seconds.
10⁻⁸ of a solar mass, you know, 10⁻⁷. I've
I
seen
don't
numbers
remember.
like 10⁻⁸, but I don't know whether that includes this limit that comes from reflection from the moon.
Maybe it's based on that. I don't. Okay, I don't remember exactly the numbers. Okay.
So, these models and try to model these periodicity, do they also have light bending effects and correction for that?
They are not really very, sophisticated models to do this. This is just, you just get a pulse profile and you see a couple of features and there is something there. But I don't think anybody is trying to model exactly what you have. We don't even know how the magnetic field structure close to the neutron star, so it's difficult to do that. But light bending is it's going to happen there for sure. Yes. So okay, so when you do the Fourier transform, you get these spikes, which are the QPOs, and it has been observed for the giant flares, and these are the 3 giant flares. The first one is a bit old, so is an unclear detection, but for the other 2 is very robust and roughly around 30 to 100 something, and then in the second one similar values, and then these high frequency QPOs. And very recently and this is very interesting, it has been able to detect also QPOs in intermediate flares. This is very important because these flares occur roughly 1 every 10 years, but these are very, very common. So if we are able to detect QPOs in every intermediate flare, this is extremely important because we will have a lot of information about these objects. So as I said, roughly the results, based on 3, are that we have low frequency QPOs, 30 to 100 something, and then in one case we have these high frequency QPOs. So you have to explain both things at once, and this is kind of difficult. These are already said.
They occur simultaneously, both the low frequency and high frequency QPO?
Sorry?
Do they occur simultaneously? Do you see them simultaneously? Or
Yes, in this flare, yes.
they come simultaneously?
Yes, yes, and these are very clear detections. So you have a lot of noise here below 30 hertz. I mean, you have to be careful with the analysis, but about 30 hertz, all these QPOs are extremely clear. So this is a very high significance of these detections. So I mean, and at the same time, even by the same instruments.
The lifetime is roughly similar in the sense that the broadening of these QPOs generally corresponds to the lifetime of the underlying oscillation. Would they comparable? Like
I think they were comparable. I think I will have to check that, but I don't remember any of them being very different to the others. But I will have to check that.
The reason is that then it can be a same driving force which can power both low frequency and high frequency if they come simultaneously and they have the same lifetime.
This is the idea. This is the idea. Try to find a model which matches both at the same time. So.
Can I follow on that? On this question of the broadening of the QPOs, what is it that broadens the QPO? Is it a finite train or is it a wandering phase, continuously wandering phase?
I'm not an expert on that, so I'm not.
But I think if you have a very strong signal, divide it in two different parts, half and half, and check their broadening, then you can sort of figure out whether they are incoherent or it's more
Right,
like,
but
yeah.
what is the answer in this particular case?
Okay, sorry. So I'm more an expert on the numerical simulations than on observations. So. Okay, so the first model was the crash shear oscillation model. So you are breaking the crash, so the first thing to think is, well, you are shaking the crash, so it's some mode in the crash. In fact, the most, I mean, you could argue that the most probable are the torsional shear oscillations of the crash, because you need less energy to excite them. So the frequencies are, so basically you can split it in two. So these are n equals 0 and n equal larger than 1 or 1 or larger. The difference is that n equals 0 most doesn't have any node in the crust, so in the radial direction. So they are basically, you can think of shear waves traveling along the crust. So the frequency is related basically to shear speed over the size of the star. On the other hand, the n equal 1 have nodes in the radial direction, so inside the crust. So these are basically shear waves traveling this direction, so they are related to shear speed over the size of the crust. So this is very nice because, I mean, if you can identify clearly both independently of the shear speed, if you assume it's isotropic, then you can start getting parameters of the star. And this is what was done by Niels and collaborators. And you can put constraints, for example, in the equation state. So if you make a clear identification, you can make very good constraints. Here you cannot see. So there is a band, the n equals 0 makes a band here of a constraint here, and this is the n equal 1 gives you a constraint here. So this small region is what where the mass and radius of the star should be. So this gives you a very.
So both VT and VR are both shear velocities. It's just the volume averaging that's different for the two, depending on the amplitude of the mode.
I think this is transverse and radial. So.
In principle, they could be different, but in the model they take it to be the same. You could have, tangential pressures and things like that, so that will affect these. So it depends on what you model for the crust.
Yes.
Isotropic, they're the same.
Okay.
In this case, the mass constant is slightly below the 1 solar mass, I think.
You shouldn't believe that.
No.
That's not worth very much here. This is a proof of principle.
Yes.
So how you would go from, if this is explanation, how you would go from a model to the observation. That's all it is. There's not a claim that this is an inference. But
So has that been actually done for the data?
No, you can't. As he will
Yeah.
tell you soon.
Yes.
We're nowhere near that.
So yes, exactly. I'm going to this point. So the main problem here is that, I mean, you have to identify the modes. You have to say that 30. So first, one very nice thing here is that since you have here a factor roughly 10 between the radius and the size of the crust, you have this same factor in the frequency. So you explain very naturally low and high frequency QPOs at the same time.
What is that? I'm sorry.
Yes, these are overtones in the radial direction, and then you have also overtones in the angular direction. So it explains very nicely these separations. The problem is that this thing here doesn't explain very well the ratios that you observe. For example, okay. So you have problems to match, for example, these things which are very close, 26, 30 is impossible to explain with this. Unless you think that these are L equal 7 or 8 and 8 or things like that. So you start doing strange things. So it's not very natural, I would say. So the second problem is that you have a very strong magnetic field. So you don't really have pure shear waves in the crust, and because it's a magnetar. And the Alfvén speed there is comparable to the shear speed, and you have to take that into account. So that it came this magnetoelastic mode, which started just as pure magnetic mode, and then it involved more, I mean, the addition of the crust and all these things. There has been a lot of work by Levin, the Tübingen group, the Southampton group, ourselves, either with some approximation for the crust or really adding a extended crust and solving the magnetoelastic equations there. So what you find there, so once you add the magnetic field, what it happens is the next. So imagine this is the neutron star, so this is the surface, and then you have different magnetic field lines. No? So you can imagine that you perturb one magnetic field line, so Alfvén waves there, torsional oscillations, behave basically as if this were a string and you were pulling the string. So you propagate along the string the Alfvén wave. So for each magnetic field line, since it has different length and different properties of the Alfvén speed along the magnetic field line, it will take a different time to cross the whole magnetic field lines. So each magnetic field line, so to say, has a different frequency. So you can excite it in a different frequency. So it's like some kind of harp, something like that. So if you go down here, you can see the actual frequency. So in terms of some parametrization of the magnetic field line. So for different magnetic field lines, you have different frequency. The frequency is changing. So inside, in the core of the neutron star, where you don't have a crust, you have a continuum. So this is not a discrete spectrum, and this is a bit, I mean, something to worry about, because this thing here is not going to oscillate at a given frequency. So what it happens is the next. So whenever you excite something in the continuum, what it tends to do, when you couple to a crust, what it tends to do is to I mean, you have a transient, and at the end, the only place where oscillations can live are in these places, at the turning points, at the extrema of the continuum. For example, here you have a maximum or a minimum. So because these places, the first derivative is basically zero, and therefore.
I'm sorry, the magnetic field is varied.
Yes.
And why those particular frequencies? I still don't get. It's continuously varying in your previous plot, or no? What produces these discrete frequencies?
These discrete frequencies? Okay, these frequencies are just associated to the extrema of the continuum. So you have a continuum, at some point you have an extrema. So you excite the continuum, I mean, it will evolve, and it has a tendency to accumulate the oscillation in the extrema, because these are the places where it's...
What are the different, these are different modes?
These are different continua, corresponding to different number of nodes. So here, the example, for example, this continua corresponds for modes with, well, modes, yes, kind of modes with, or QPOs with one node in the center, with two nodes, etc., etc.
What are the frequencies on the right hand side? What are those L's?
That's the lower.
Yes, we call upper and lower QPOs. I mean, it's just a notation.
Those are the ones that live in the,
Yes.
the difference in the where they live in the, so those that live in the.
One is the lowest, the other is the highest.
Those are promoidal, toroidal, essentially.
Uh,
Loosely speaking, right?
yes,
In
this.
that closed region.
These live in the closed region, in the closed magnetic field line region, so you will never observe these things. This is internal oscillations. And those things are, I mean, the surface is oscillating here, so you have a chance of seeing something outside.
That statement can't be true, because that mode there, L1 say, will shake the crust, which is the outer 10%, right? So, isn't that right? Or is that?
Yes, that's true. I mean,
you can see that.
well, not this one because this doesn't have a crust, but if you put a crust,
If you put a crust on there,
then it will oscillate something. But these are, I mean, this I will talk about this later. This magnetic field line, everything that you excite around here, these magnetic field lines are very short here. So, I mean, it's always easy to get an observation if you excite something around here.
And there's no toroidal component?
No, not for the simulations. No, in the simulations there is. This is pure toroidal, yes. Yes. Okay. So, and also there are some, I mean, even if you can have these QPOs here, this is not modes. This is not the entire star oscillating with a single frequency. So this may not be long-lived. So there are some claims that they may not survive long enough. So I mean, you have to think that this is around 30 hertz, the smallest frequency, and they have to last for several hundreds of seconds. So they have to be sure. I mean, it's better if it is a mode. We will feel more comfortable if we could find some modes, because then, I mean, you are sure that they can survive probably for these long times. So what happens when we include the crust, so an extended crust? So the first thing to notice is that waves in the crust doesn't behave as, I mean, you only have one kind of wave in the crust, not two. So it's a mixture of Alfvén waves and shear waves. This should be the Alfvén speed, and this the shear speed. So it's a combination of both. So not two waves, but only one combined, such that in the limit of very strong magnetic field compared to the shear modulus, then you have basically Alfvén waves, and in the limit of very small magnetic field, you have shear waves. The problem is that if you take the numbers, so if you make the numbers for a magnetar, typical Alfvén speed, or the contribution to this number of the Alfvén speed, is 10 to the 8, 10 to the 9 centimeters per second, which is basically the same as the typical speeds for the, I mean, typical shear speed of the crust. So you are in a worst case scenario in which both are comparables, and you are not in a limiting case, which will be much easier.
What's mu s?
This is the shear modulus. So shear, yes. So mu s over rho is the shear speed square.
Okay, and then also the magnetic field lines that go to the crust that you call open, they actually continue outside,
yes,
right?
Yes.
But you fix them at that point? They don't move in your model?
No, they move. They move. In fact, in the previous, I mean, you can see here the structure of the mode. They have a maximum at the surface. This is a continuous traction boundary condition. So it's just imposing that that you have continuity in the magnetic field at the surface, basically, and that ideal MSD holds. So yes, numerical simulations. So we are using this COCOA code, which is part of the Coconut code. So this is a code intended for core collapse simulations, but we made some tweaks here to be able to do these simulations. So we are.
I have a question.
Yes.
My question about. So you talked about these torsional modes and Alfvén waves.
Yes.
What about the ones which couple to density oscillations, say magnetosonic waves, just coupling to perturbations of the density and in B squared?
Yes, the problem with those, I mean, I will say something later, so about polar oscillation, basically, because polar oscillation is where you have coupling of Alfvén waves and magnetosonic waves and all these kind of things. The problem with those is that you are fighting against gravity. So if you put the same energy, for example, in torsional oscillations and in axial oscillations, you will get much lower amplitudes in the axial oscillations. Just because you are using this energy that you put just to move against the gravity. While in torsional oscillations, you're basically, I mean, not doing anything against gravity. So that's why they are usually discarded. I mean, not completely, but
I would think the argument would just say they would be found at higher frequency. I didn't know why that argument also applies why the amplitude should be smaller.
Okay, so magnetosonics, which is basically sound speed, they are much higher frequency.
Yeah.
So this is above kilohertz.
You will occur at the same higher frequency, but the same total energy. Amplitude will be lower.
Yeah. So Alfvén waves, poloidal Alfvén waves, I will talk later, is a random factor 5 or something like that, larger frequency. So we are basically using, I mean, just torsional oscillations. So we are doing just torsional oscillations what I'm going to show, it only works, I mean, it's only valid for low amplitude oscillations. So we are in the limit of low amplitude oscillations. And doing ideal MSD in axis symmetry. Okay. So the first thing that we thought is, well, okay, let's go to low magnetic fields, because with low magnetic field, we know that in the crust we should have something which behaves as shear waves. And therefore, we are back to the crustal modes, which kind of fit everything. So the problem with that is that, okay, here we did some simulations in which we excite the crust with an eigenfunction of one of the crustal modes. No, so in this case is L equal 2, n equals 0, L equal 2, and we let it evolve. So if you don't put any magnetic field, this is the black line. So this is the amplitude with time. So it basically stays, some numerical dissipation, but basically stays there. So if you increase the magnetic field, then you get immediately a damping. This damping is related to the fact that you are coupling these crustal oscillations with the inner core. So you are transmitting the energy to the core. So the more you increase the magnetic field, it rapidly damps. So you see here, sorry?
You said it goes into the core, but ultimately where is it?
It remains in the core. In the next slide I will show that, but it stays in the core. So already for 2 times 10 to the 14, you get a extremely fast spin down in hundreds of milliseconds, which is completely incompatible with an observation of several hundreds of seconds. So even for 10 to the 13 is not compatible with QPOs at hundreds of observed during hundreds of seconds.
Sorry, what are you plotting on the y-axis?
This is basically the amplitude of the mode. This is the
and does the decay rate scale simply with magnetic field?
Here. So they scale with so the damping time is basically a fraction of the Alfvén crossing time. This is for many different modes, excitations of the modes. So you basically have the roughly 4%, around 4% of the Alfvén crossing time is the damping time. So this is extremely fast. So they basically immediately get absorbed by the core. And once they get there, they don't go back. So the core crust interface is become reflective, and basically they bounce there and they do whatever they do, but inside the core. And the crust at the end is, I mean, you don't have any oscillation there. So this is the next slide. So here I'm increasing the magnetic field and showing different QPOs. I mean, this is with 1 node, 2 nodes, and 3 nodes, I think, and increasing the magnetic field. And what you see is that the final state is that it's completely confined inside the core. So it's just reflecting at the crust interface due to the huge jump in the propagation velocity. So here is much lower than in the crust, which is just the shear speed. So as you increase the magnetic field, when you reach values which are comparable, V squared comparable to the shear modulus, then things start getting into the crust. So, which in principle, these things wouldn't be observable because it's impossible to see anything independent of the emission mechanism. If you don't shake the surface, you won't see this. So starting here, you start seeing something at the surface, and in the very high magnetic field limit, you recover the results without crust, basically.
How do you put the crust in your simulations?
So we are evolving basically the displacement of elements with respect to a frame, and yes, that gives you the stress, and that couples with the velocity of the fluid, and so it's just the magnetoelastic equations, which are cool. In the linear regime. So this is valid only for linear elastic perturbations.
So, but I guess, how do you what do you set the threshold for where the crust is? Is this something you set?
It's some density. I don't remember exactly. It's just something from literature.
Will not tell you. The equation of state will not give you a precise location for the crust.
Not the equation of state, but there are computations of where the crust starts and these kind of things. I don't remember the exact number.
As a sharp surface.
We try several things. We try sharp surface, something more continuous. It doesn't really make a big difference. So I think here at the end we are just putting a discontinuity. But if you put something smoother, it doesn't change at all. So polar modes. So there has been some claims that maybe polar modes can explain the high frequency QPOs, while the axial modes explain the low frequency QPOs. The problem is that you have to compare apols with apols. So there are different simulations, and it's a bit difficult. So what I did here is try to put both together. I don't know if successfully. So so I tried to collect from several authors, because we haven't done polar modes. But I have to collect the work from Tuvenger Group and Southampton with ours, and choosing models which are as similar as possible, if possible the same, and looking through the different conventions for the magnetic field strength to choose exactly the same model. So here I put, so this is magnetic field, this is frequency. So this line here are observations. So these are the low frequency QPOs and the high frequency QPOs. These two are also the observations of the magnetic field. So you can think of these two lines as lower bounds for the magnetic field. And these are the QPOs. The QPOs depend on the magnetic field, are proportional to the magnetic field, basically. So this region here, you won't have any QPO at the surface. So, you cannot believe, anything here, because it wouldn't produce anything at the surface. So it's only from here to here. And I will explain later why we don't like this region, but anyway. So what you see is that axial modes are basically here, while polar modes stay here. So, yes, you can start explaining, for example, if you don't believe this one because it's below 30 Hertz, you can explain these ones here, but then the polar ones go there. So it's still difficult to reach here. You can reach, with the polar modes, you can reach over 1,000 Hertz, but then you have problems matching the lower ones. So both at the same time is a bit difficult.
But you're assuming that the magnetic field in the core and on the surface are the same. You said these modes, the polar modes would be confined to the core, while the axial mode would be surface modes. And magnetic field can be different on the surface and in the core.
Yes.
So wouldn't it be better to consider magnetic field in the core and magnetic field on the surface?
You mean for this?
Yes.
Okay, so for this, I think all the models have the same magnetic field structure everywhere, or almost the same. That's why I'm comparing. So what it happens if you change the magnetic field, which is perfectly fine, is in the next slide. So it's a different. So, but at least for a given magnetic field configurations, this is what you get. So now, what happens if you change the magnetic field? I mean, you can do it in many ways. We have tried to change this is the current, to play with the current, which gives you many different poloidal-like magnetic field structures. Putting quadrupolar components, you can get asymmetries, north-south. You can get purely quadrupolar field. I mean, you can do many things, and in general, what it happens is that you can change the structure of the continuum. Here you have an example. You can have additional turning points. So once you add this degree of freedom, or here, if you have north or south asymmetries, you can have that the north and the south QPOs are slightly different frequencies. So you can, I mean, if you want, you can always explain the observations. I think is I don't remember. We had a model which explained all the frequencies in one of the observations. But I mean, it's just an example. This is completely degenerate. You can find, I guess, infinite magnetic field structures which match the observations. So if you put in a similar plot, this is how it looks like. So I mean, just to get an idea. So these are all just keeping. I mean, I keep here the spin down magnetic field. So all these magnetic field lines in the same vertical line will be observed with the same PP dot place, but will produce a large variety, you see, from here to here of frequencies. There is one particular, this red one. This is a magnetic field confined to the crust. We tried with that. This one is extremely difficult to, I mean, it's the only one which we think we can put some constraint. So it's very difficult to get right the QPO frequencies with this one, because I mean, it's not possible to reach basically this region here, in which you are matching at the same time the low frequency QPOs and the magnetic field, because it basically turns this way. But I mean, it's difficult to say if this is a very strong constraint. So the next thing is superfluidity. So far everything has been done without superfluidity. But we know that superfluidity is important. So it's probably present. There are observations, these Cassiopeia observations, which indicate that maybe there are superfluid cores in neutron stars. You have pulsar glitches. So I mean, it's something to consider really seriously, to put superfluidity inside. Well, so when you put superfluidity, what is happening is just that you are decoupling the protons and the neutrons in the core. But the thing is that Alfvén waves are basically coupling to charged particles. So when an Alfvén wave goes through the matter, you're basically moving the protons. So if in a normal fluid, both things go together. So if you move a proton, the neutrons go behind. But in a superfluid, what happens is that when you move the proton, the neutron doesn't feel anything, or almost anything. So that means that effectively the density which appears in the Alfvén speed has to be reduced just by the fraction of protons in the fluid. So since the fraction of protons is roughly 5% in the interior in the core of the neutron star, you get an increase of the Alfvén speed in the core of about a factor 5, while in the crash you get, even if you have superfluid neutrons, they are much more coupled to the lattice, so you don't get this effect. So you don't get this extra factor. So this produces a jump in the Alfvén speed at the core crust interface. So what you are going to get is, first you get an increase of the magnetic field of the frequency. That means that you need a weaker magnetic field to explain the same frequency. You also broaden this band. So this thing here is going, this limit here in which the oscillations on the interior reach the surface goes down to lower magnetic fields. So you make this thing much wider, which is also very nice. So the explanation for that is here. Let's see if this is clear. So this is non-superfluid and superfluid. This is the velocity. And the red one is the magnetoelastic, so to say. And these are just the contributions from the shear speed and the magnetic field. So here in the non-superfluid case is continuous the Alfvén speed. So you just have a jump, and here you have a discontinuity just because this thing is 5 times larger than this one, roughly speaking. So when an Alfvén waves come from the interior, it gets reflected because there is a big jump in the magnetoelastic velocity, and also here. So for low magnetic fields, below 10 to the 14, you just get reflection and you don't get anything at the surface. So when you increase the magnetic field, what it happens is that you go 5 times larger. In the non-superfluid case, it's still too low. So you're still here, big jump, and reflection. But in this case, you get to a point in which this jump is not so large, or even non-existent, which means that you start getting things going from the core to the crust. So you start seeing things at the surface. But what is more interestingly is that the Alfvén contribution is still very low. So in the crust, it still behaves as a solid, elastic solid. So basically, the magnetoelastic speed here is basically the shear speed. So you have basically shear speed here, Alfvén speed here, and they are very similar. So if you try to do the same thing in the normal fluid, so increase the magnetic field further until you match both frequencies, I mean the Alfvén speed and the shear speed, then what it happens is that the contribution here to the magnetoelastic speed is not of the Alfvén part is not negligible. So this thing here, it doesn't behave anymore as a elastic solid, so because there is an important Alfvén contribution. So in this case here, you are going to have Alfvén QPOs, as I showed you before, just because this thing here is almost Alfvén waves or magnetoelastic. So you have a very strong contribution of the Alfvén speed, while in the previous case, you have an interaction of Alfvén waves with shear waves, and this is very interesting, and both at the same velocity.
Do you have written down how the Alfvén speed depends on the properties of matter? So you said that it couples to protons, but it doesn't couple to neutrons. How does one actually see it? What's the equation that determines the Alfvén speed in a superfluid?
The equation, I mean, for that you will have to write, I guess, 2 fluid equations for neutrons and protons with magnetic fields and derive the whole thing. What we are doing here is much more simple. It's just the argument that I did here. We are not doing anything else. This is the whole argument is this one.
He's just doing V squared over rho and changing rho.
Yes, you change rho and that's all.
Takes the changes from the whole density to just the proton. That's the trick.
So it's the equation you were showing before.
Yes, yes, it's just this equation. So I mean, this is everything we do. This is the simplest thing that you can do to add this effect.
I want to get the take-home message there. The frequencies for the shear and go to those slides. You're exciting, let's say, some modes in the crust, and you're saying that there could be transfer of energy from the core to crust.
Well, I mean, if you don't have a big jump, then you can have a transfer.
But can you really? What tells you that there was? Oh, this was from the core. Is it the frequency? No, the frequencies will still be the same, right? So, is there a way? So, will you see, depending on what mechanism is operating, less or more energy?
At the surface?
Yeah. Because what tells you whether, oh, this was just excited in the crust and not coming from the core? So, what was the point of this exercise, is what I'm trying to figure out.
The point is what I'm going to show you in the next slide, is because here you can form kind of a resonance.
Yes.
Because you still have.
But how will it tell you whether it was not actually this? But
the problem of this is that Alfvén QPOs in principle are not long-lived. So it's difficult to explain hundreds of seconds durations with this mechanism. While if you have some kind of modes, then in principle, unless you find some dissipation mechanism which damps these oscillations, they could last for several hundreds of seconds. This is the most important thing, I think. Yes. And this is exactly what we show. So when you increase the magnetic field until you reach this level that you were showing, what you see is that this is the oscillation pattern basically, and this is the phase. Here I'm showing the phase. So the oscillation is getting into the crust. Here is already completely in the crust. And at this point you go from something which is, here this is the phase, so here you're seeing constant phase along magnetic field lines, but you have that each magnetic field line has a different phase. This is a continuum. So when you go to this case, you have something which is, so for the open magnetic field lines, you have constant phase everywhere. So this is basically, it behaves as a mode. So we don't know the eigenvalue problem of which this mode is resolved, but it behaves basically as a mode. So we have been doing numerical simulations of this, and I mean, you can keep this thing oscillating with constant phase for more than 200 Alfvén crossing times. So this is basically stable. And we think it's kind of a resonance between the crust and the Alfvén continuum, which is only possible here because the crust still behaves as an elastic crust, basically, because of this big jump in the Alfvén speed. So also it appears for a very broad range, so you don't have to fine-tune, because on one side in the crust you have frequencies, discrete frequencies, so to say, but in the interior you have a continuum. So basically anything, if you increase or decrease the magnetic field, anything will match, and you can always form resonances with the continuum. It's possible to do something like this. So after we saw this, we went back to the normal fluid and tuning the magnetic field, the model, and everything. You can find the exact point in which you get this. But you really need a lot of fine-tuning to do that. So it's not generic. And we think that, I mean, Pasamonti and Lander have observed the same thing in their simulations recently. And we think that the simulations of Bach-Hoven, probably they are showing the same thing, but with a slightly different interpretation of the results. The nice thing is that this also happens with n equal 1 modes. So you put an equal 1 mode, and it resonates with the continuum. This is a very high order continuum with a lot of nodes, but you get something which is long-lived for more than 1,000 cycles. We did the simulations, so this is completely stable. So in principle, with this mechanism, you can explain both low frequency and high frequency QPO. They are long-lived, which is something that we didn't have before. What else? Yeah, and very nicely they appear, since they are resonances, they are not exactly the crustal modes, but they are always nearby, because they are resonating with the continuum, which is kind of nice, because we get, the observations give us something which roughly matches the crustal mode, but with problems. And this kind of tells you that, well, you can solve these problems in a very difficult way, but probably you can sort it out. Well, with a normal fluid, you can also get the resonance in this case, but for example, it looks completely different. So it's exciting magnetic field lines down here, which probably won't be observable, and this kind of thing. So this is a bit unrealistic, I would say. So can we say something on the nature of magnetar QPOs? Well, okay, the first thing is that if you just take the Alfvén QPOs, this is extremely degenerate problem, magnetic field strength and structure. I showed you equation of states, I didn't comment, but it enters the equation of state, it enters the mass, enters the superfluid properties, so what is the proton fraction? We are just putting 5%, but I mean, can be 10, can be 15, I don't know. What is the fraction of the core which is superfluid? We are putting the whole core, but it may be just a fraction. Do we have superconductivity? I mean, all these kind of things are very difficult to quantify, I would say, and this is extremely degenerated. So I'm sure that you can explain all the observations in some way, but probably it's not realistic. So what doesn't fit? So low magnetic fields doesn't fit because of this problem of the confinement in the core. Sorry, this is wrong. This is crust. A magnetic field confined in the crust, it was not matching very well for the models that we look at. I don't know if this is completely ruled out. I wouldn't say ruled out, but we have difficulties. It's the only magnetic field with which we have magnetic difficulties to get into the region of the frequencies plus magnetic field. And in general, with non-superfluid cores, we have problems because we are just getting the Alfvén QPOs which are not long-lived. Models that fit better, I say that just if you have some superfluid component. So far, this is what it's the only thing that it was fitting everything. But variants of this could also fit, like putting superconducting cores, or I don't know. Yes.
The last point is that a long-lived constant phase QPO, so the QPO phase does not alter over a single oscillation period.
Sorry, the
QPO phase, the oscillation, underlying oscillation does not change in phase, right? So it is long-lived for the whole oscillation of 1,000 cycles?
Yes, it lasts for 1,000 cycles with constant phase and the same structure. I mean, it's and frequency. Yes.
And also the spin frequency of this characteristic centroid frequency also doesn't change for it.
The frequency, no.
So it should be very high quality factor signal, very narrow coherent signal.
Yes, we have a measure on that. Over 100, I think. But maybe I'm mistaken. I will have to check the paper. We have in the paper. But yes, it was quite high quality. Yes. Okay, so the last point of this part is very quickly is magnetosphere and emission. So yes.
Sorry, before you completely leave. QPO question. When possibly silly question. So all of these models are considering essentially modes within the neutron star itself.
Yes.
My question was, you have a fairly young neutron star when you're talking about this magnetar QPO. So there's a possibility that you still have some remaining matter externally that, let's say, is still in the process of falling back, maybe in some sort of a torus or disk.
Or disk, yes.
Is there any possibility that it could be involved in producing some of these models?
Okay, in fact, there is some people who have been working on that in trying to explain the QPOs with disk. So from what I know, their latest paper, they have to put high magnetic field to explain the observations. So they are basically moving from non-magnetized with accretion disk to a magnetar with an accretion disk. So, I mean, it's not ruled out, but you can explain it, I think you can explain it without the accretion disk. So, but there is some people working on that, yes.
And there is no observational evidence
that
would tell you whether you have a significant disk or
there is no observational evidence of accretion in these systems. There's no evidence for fallback of disks at all. Apart from if you want to go down that and you get increasingly desperate that you have to explain magnetars that way. But I think that's, the consensus view is that there's not.
Are you completely going from this to another topic? I mean, questions?
Yes.
Come later?
No. I mean, you can ask whenever you want. I don't know.
Yeah.
Ask whatever you want.
Yes.
I think you're dealing mostly with mode structure. What about the amplitudes, relative amplitudes in different things? Is that something that you can handle?
Okay, the amplitude of these things, you can make an estimate based on the breaking strain. So if you know the breaking strain, I mean there is computation on the breaking strain of the crust. So this is an upper limit of what is the maximum amplitude that you can have. So you know that it has to be smaller than that.
I agree, but observations can tell you the amplitude.
No, this is the problem. This is the problem. So this is the second part. So once you know, imagine you know how large is the oscillation of the surface of the star. Now you have to transfer this to the observations. How large is the modulation in the X-ray signal? And for this you need the model of the magnetosphere. And this is the next step that we are doing that. Just to try to relate amplitudes at the surface, basically, with amplitudes in the X-ray signal. And this is the thing which is not easy at all, I would say.
Okay, the second question is that I think I do understand that this is still in its infancy and you can't fit everything perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess you have hit upon the point I was going to ask. It's a heavily degenerate problem. But even so, you can make a bifurcation of the parameter space that you have, and ask questions in a Bayesian way.
Yes.
Which part of my parameter space is consistent with the data?
Yeah.
Is there effort in that particular direction going? It's true that you can't really, because it's a heavily degenerate problem.
But Satya, the questions in the list there, some of the questions are still too big to make that right. Yeah, I think that,
can't be incorporated in...
One of the problems is that to study each point of the parameter space means numerical simulations, which are expensive. So, even if you
have to do it for different masses, for instance. That must be a scaling.
Yes, there is a scaling. There is some paper of Nick Stergules showing some scaling.
So of state, I don't know whether you
I think you can. There is a scaling with the compactness, I think. So probably you can hide everything in the compactness.
And similarly,
but still.
Then you've got superfluid pairing gaps, and you just list the parameters you need to put in, and the list is a long shopping list. Some of this we don't, the way it's been incorporated here is, as you said, is just testing can this fix the problem. And I think pointing in the
too long the list.
It's too long for you to do what you wanted to do. But of course, on the other hand, you come from the side, where Monte Carlos and a few 100,000 things don't scare you. They scare me, right? But so I think we get this is pointing in the
how much can the data constrain is what we are asking. It's true that there are too many parameters and big shopping list, but still, you may be able to say, hey, does it belong to that region or this region?
My feeling is unless you can address the emission problem, what comes out as X-ray, so how does it actually affect the X-ray light curve?
So we're going back to
we're not
yesterday's
ready.
thing.
We're not ready for that. We're back to the question we talked about yesterday. You know, how do you go from these simulations to actual electromagnetic observations? And I think that's when you can do that, then you can start playing that. Otherwise, I think it's difficult.
We are putting more effort right now in the mission rather than putting more ingredients, which I mean, as you said, this is, I don't know. I mean, it's so degenerate that I don't know if we will get some constraint.
Well, I have a question about the fraction of the core. I mean, in the case you have considered, it was essential that the core and the crust could communicate at one point. You just lower the gap and you can resonate. What if there is something between the core, the superfluid core, and the crust, which doesn't allow this? What if there is something else, a non-superfluid core? Would all of this break?
I'm not sure. We will have to do the simulations. I mean, it will partly break, but still you are changing the frequencies of the continuum of the core. So it's difficult to say it without doing. Maybe, but I don't know.
Yeah, you were using as evidence for superfluidity the observations of Cassay. So that interpretation actually makes a specific prediction for the size of the gap.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, it requires that the protons be superconducting.
Yeah.
So can you use those constraints too?
Okay, adding superconductivity I think is more difficult because it means going away from ideal MSD. The only argument that I can do is that these are magnetars, so the magnetic field is much stronger, and for this magnetic field there is the possibility that these things are not superconducting. But this is the only argument I can do. We don't really have...
Since the protons would have a higher critical temperature than the neutrons, would that imply that their critical field would be larger as well? So the neutrons are superfluid.
I think the key thing that can save him here is that the critical field for superconductivity is very close to the fields that he's working with. So when you essentially, if you do this naive change of magnetic tension from B squared to H critical times B, they're roughly the same.
Yeah.
I mean, there's not orders of magnitude different like in a pulsar or in other systems. Here, they're very close. I mean, still that's an error, right? But it might not be orders of magnitude wrong. I think that could save you. That's not saying you shouldn't do it. It's just saying, look, if you can't do it yet, then at least that's an argument saying that maybe I don't need to worry, all night long.
But it's something to consider. Superconductivity is something that is always there, and for a reason, because it's something which is relevant. So.
So I have a question about crust nodes. You explored a large parameter space. You tried to explain everything just with alphane continuum, alphane waves in the core. You had this problem with timescales. Then you came back. You had this more complicated model with the superfluid core on the crust. So, am I correct to deduce that the only successful model requires a crust with specific torsional modes?
With the specific which...
without a crust and torsional modes of the crust, it is impossible to explain this.
So pure magnetic,
you have pure alphane QPOs, and I mean, then probably these are not long-lived.
Yeah, so given the parameter study, can you conclude that it is essential, there are inessential components to the whole model that we have to work very hard to discover, but I'm trying to understand whether there's an essential component which you cannot do without, because you also found that after the more complicated analysis that the real frequencies you got were actually close to the crustal frequencies. So it's like I have an oscillator that has very specific frequencies, but it's coupled to this really messy, complex continuum.
Yes, this is the idea.
And then when you hit the oscillator, you're not going to find exactly those frequencies. You're going to do a very complicated problem.
Yes.
So if we can deduce that, yes, there's a 10% or 20% corrections to all the frequencies that can emerge from this coupling, then we've learned something. We've learned.
Yes.
So I'm trying to find whether there's a hole in that argument.
this may be a way of going, but I cannot tell you how far away from the real frequencies they are going to be.
You know, so I worked on this problem off and on from the beginning, I guess, in a sense. And I think it's interesting to see that after a lot of effort on magnetic modes, the main result at the moment seems to point to the superfluid, you know, presence of superfluidity essentially pushing you back towards the pure crust modes where you started, because you evacuate that part of the spectrum, right? And I think is important because it points to some problems we can look at. Like Jim said, you can do a better model for more realistic neutron star with more realistic superfluidity. We could potentially do superconductivity. I mean, that's within reach, right? So that can be done, and then you could maybe do what Satya is saying. It's not, you know, whereas a couple of years ago when there was huge discussion about this magnetic continuum and whatnot, and nobody understood at all what was going on. I mean, then we were lost. Right? But now this is beginning to point to a direction where, you know, you can do this.
Yes, maybe.
Sanjay, was your question have the aim of proving that these stars have crusts?
There is something that, you know, there is a minimal physics content that is required to explain this. And initially, like Nils said, you know, people said it could be anything. And now, as we begin to explore more and more, we are finding no, it can't really be anything, because there are problems with a lot of other suggestions, and you need there is a necessary component.
So I would have argued that already from the beginning. The graph from our paper, which is, you know, it was proof of principle, but still, if you predict a mass that's, you know, within an order of something less than 2 with that model, I think that tells you that you're looking in the right place. Then you're looking for things that can shift it a little bit, right? But you're not looking for something that can shift it in order of magnitude. You're looking for something that can shift it a little bit.
So within this interpretation, you would get a very interesting constraint on shear velocities in the crust. So you basically go and figure out something that's, you know, quote unquote fundamental. You'd say the shear modulus in the crust is not between 0 and infinity. It's between some two numbers that are of interest to.
But you're saying there is a crust.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's very likely that there is a crust, but
The quark star people will not be happy.
okay.
Say that there's no crust?
No. Just do the emission part and save the other stuff for the discussion later. You were going to talk about the simulations on
MRI.
the box simulation, because then we can give them a little bit more time. And then, does that make sense?
To make
save the box simulations for the discussion in the afternoon.
It's fine for me.
Because that we had that discussion yesterday. That makes sense, right?
Okay.
Okay.
And then, you know,
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, then. Okay. Perfect. So in any case, this is very quick because this is work in progress. So what we are trying now is we now have the interior, no? We have oscillations, we know how it behaves at the surface, how it's shaking the exterior. So that the idea now is first build a magnetosphere. So these are, we are building force-free magnetospheres because it's a natural thing to do here. So the boundary conditions is just the surface of the star, what we get from the simulations with time dependence. And for each snapshot, for each time, we build a force-free static solution. So we can do that because in this case, the time scales in which the magnetic field at the surface is changing is much larger than the Alfvén crossing time of the magnetosphere. Basically, it's this, that the Alfvén crossing time of the star is much larger than the Alfvén crossing time of the magnetosphere, at least for magnetic field lines which are outside this small region along the pole. Around the pole, these magnetic field lines are very long, so if you shake it, it will take much longer to fill the complete magnetosphere that you shake it. But within a huge region, basically everything happens immediately. You change a bit the magnetic field lines at the surface, and everything readjusts immediately to these force-free static configurations. So this is what we did. This is an example of I mean, this is evolution. This is the magnetosphere. The neutron star is here inside, imposing the boundary condition for simulations, and I mean, you get some structure on the.
Your star is non-rotating.
It's non-rotating. Yes, magnetars have very slow rotation, so light cylinder is very far away. So you can assume near the star that you have these force-free static solutions and non-rotating. So this.
And what is it you're showing here?
So this is toroidal field. I think everything is toroidal field. So I mean, since you are twisting the magnetosphere, you are forming a toroidal field. This is the important thing here is that once you twist the magnetic field, you are producing currents in the magnetosphere, and this is a very important thing for the mission.
Do you have plots of the currents?
No, but no. I don't have it here. Maybe I have it somewhere. I mean, they are just parallel to the magnetic field lines because this is just force free. So, okay. So we also have been doing some studies on the transmission of Alfvén waves at the surface. So this is motivated by some paper by Link, very recent paper, Link 2014, in which he makes the argument that if you have an Alfvén wave which is reaching the surface and wants to transmit into the magnetospheres, since you have a very large jump in the propagation speed, basically you have speed of light in the magnetosphere, and you have something around 10 to the 8 centimeters per second in the interior. Then you will have reflection. So this is exactly the same argument that we are using for the core crash interface. So we were a bit worried about this, so we did some ideal MSD simulations, including simulating not only the core, the interior of the star, but also an extended part of the magnetic field. So what we observed, just look first at this part of the plot. Color is where you have some amplitude. So where the amplitude is possible. So basically what we see is that for a very narrow part here, you get exactly this effect. So any oscillation here just bounces back to the interior because this jump. However, from 10 degrees more or less on, you get perfect transmission. So the reason for that is you have to compare the length of the magnetic field line with the wavelength of the oscillations. So in this region, the length of the magnetic field line is much larger than the wavelength of the oscillations that you have outside. That means that the arguments that Link is doing, are perfectly valid. So you can compute the transmission coefficients and everything, and you get that the transmission is zero, basically. But when you are here, the length of the magnetic field line is much smaller than the wavelength. So that means that whenever you move a bit here, this point, this thing here feels it immediately. So this computation of the transmission coefficients, you cannot do it in the same way, because basically you don't have in the transmitted part, you don't have waves. You just have something which is connected directly to the other side and which moves basically rigidly. So and that's why is not working in this case. So this is nice because I mean at least we know now that it's really, I mean, if you shake the surface, you shake the magnetosphere, or at least a large part of the magnetosphere is shaken. So these symmetric perturbations correspond to twists. So it means that in the north pole and the south pole you are moving in the opposite direction. So you are twisting the magnetic field in the exterior. What happens if you look at antisymmetric perturbations? So this is related to the number of nodes in the interior. That means that you are moving in the same direction, both footprints. So what you see here is perfect reflection at the surface of the star. So the explanation for that can be seen also in terms of the force-free static solution. So if you just take a twisted foot point like this, and you compute the force-free solution, this solution exists. So you can get a configuration which is force-free, stable, and static. If you try to do the same thing here, you just do it like this and try to compute a force-free configuration, it doesn't exist. So there is no force-free static solution for this configuration. And this is kind of an explanation of what is going on here. So one important consequence of this is that these symmetric perturbations, as you remember in all these continua and all those things, the frequencies behave roughly as 1, 3, 5 integrals, while these things are 2, 4, 6, whatever. And this corresponds exactly to some of the frequencies observed in the QPOs. So you are observing the QPOs things which are 30 hertz, 90 hertz, 150 hertz, but you are not observing the 60 hertz or the 2, 4, whatever. So this is a very plausible explanation for at least some of the sequences of the observed QPOs. Just this thing. So why is important to have twisted magnetic field in the exterior? So why is important to have currents in the magnetic field? How is that related to the modulation of the X-ray emission? So our model for this emission is the next. So imagine you have the neutron star which is emitting X-rays, or some fireball close to the star which is emitting in X-rays. The fireball is emitting X-rays. Basically, it's a black body because it's just thermal. And now, since the magnetic field is very, very large, what you have here is that these photons can scatter resonantly with the charge carriers, electrons and positrons, in the magnetic field line. So whenever you have a twist, you have currents, and you have scatter. This resonant cyclotron scattering in these currents, and this is going to modify the spectrum. So you are going to go from a black body, which was the original emission, to something else, typically at a harder component. So what we are doing is starting to do Monte Carlo simulations for magnetosphere, trying to follow all these. Basically to model this scenario in which you have, we know the currents because we can model it using this force-free. We can model the electron, positron, the scatter of photons into electrons and positrons. This is possible. And the physical ingredients, well, you need the scattering cross-sections, you need the distribution of seed photons, typically a black body, modeling the fireball. You need the spatial distribution of charge carrier. We already have, because this is just the structure outside, the force-free magnetic field. And this is the problem. We need the momentum distribution of charge carrier. So it's not enough to have the current, but you need the exact distribution, because this determines what is the outcome of the spectrum. So our plan is to couple this Monte Carlo for the photons to what we call particle in a line simulation. So basically, electrons and positrons are attached to magnetic field lines, so you can do kind of particle in cell simulations, but just along magnetic field lines. So this is the idea. So similar work has been done by Bedelov during the last years to explain the quiescence emission. He has a lot of work on that. We are trying to do that to explain the QPOs and with a slightly different approach, but to explain the QPOs in the SGRs. Yes.
So I don't know if you've explained this or you're going to or not, but this thing has to be not the whole star, right? And this is actually symmetric. You need something that's going to get manipulated.
Yes. So in principle, it's Monte Carlo, so you can do it non-axis symmetric. So
this will produce asymmetries?
If you just put, it depends on how you choose the distribution of seed photons. If you just choose a region on one side and you choose that this is the region of emitting photons, you will get something asymmetric. Yes.
But what would be the motivation? How would that develop in a star? I guess it's not clear to me how the asymmetry comes in.
Okay, the symmetry. The symmetry depends on how the crash breaks. So when you break the crash, after some evolutions of thousands of years, you break the crash at some point. And this creates this creates the flare and the asymmetry. So the place, supposedly the place where you break the crust is where you produce the...
It's not just a continue, there's going to be a breakage and then it's going to oscillate and radiate.
Yes. So, I mean, it's unclear exactly how it happens, but the symmetry is coming from the fact that you are not going to, that you are going to break in one place or several places, but and this will produce the symmetries, yes.
Is it fair to think that the seed photons have a black body spectrum? Is there any observation of it?
Yes, the observations fit to two black bodies or black body plus power law. So these are the observations. So our idea is to put the black body, roughly what you get from the observations, and try to get the other part from the simulations. So this is the idea, or the motivation. So, so here I'm giving an example. It's just an example. What we did for simplicity is just to fix the momentum distribution. We are just choosing Maxwellian momentum distribution with a velocity of 0.3 c. And this case is very low. I mean, the seed photons are just a black body with 0.5 keV, which is the quiescent state of. So for the case of flares, this is something like 30 or something like that. So this is kind of a test. What you get is the next. So the seed black body is the dashed line, and as you vary in time, this is variation in time of one of our simulations. So as the model evolves, you are changing the magnetosphere, you are changing the current, so the scattering proceeds differently. So if you wouldn't have any twist in the magnetospheres, there wouldn't be any interaction, so you will just get the black body. Once you have currents, you get something, some hard component here. So for example here, as you go in time, this thing is going down, or here in this example is going down. So you can imagine this thing here will go up and down depending on what is going on in the magnetosphere, basically. Be careful here, because this thing here depends critically on this thing here. So depending on what you put here, you can do this much larger or much smaller.
That is a monochromatic spectrum of black.
Well, this is just Maxwellian. Yes. Yes. I mean, the idea of the code is to do it self-consistently. So this is the goal, to make self-consistent simulations in which this thing here, the distribution is related to the interaction with the photons, and the photons spectrum is related to the distribution. So you have to evolve both things until it converts to something. So this is the final goal. So far, we are in this stage, just making some tests.
Can I ask another question?
Yes.
Presumably the charges in the magnetosphere will also emit by other mechanisms, synchrotron maybe.
Yes, yes.
That could be a testable prediction.
Yes.
They should come together. So
yes.
If in principle one could observe both parts, both components of the
yes.
emission, they should have relations with each other.
Yes, this is something we would like to do in the future for sure. For this example, what we did is just to change the amplitude at the surface, the amplitude of the oscillations, and to see how is the modulation. So we make an integration on this band, which is roughly the band in which the detector were observing for the giant flares, in which the QPOs were observed, and you see how the flux is changing. Of course, if you put a very small amplitude of the oscillations, you basically don't get anything, and if you increase to 1 kilometer in this case, you start seeing things, and this is 10 kilometers, which is clearly unrealistic, and you see larger things. So, there are many things here which has to be changed. The self-consistency of this thing here, this has to be increased. These numbers are not realistic, but we are already getting modulation, and we can see that in the Fourier transform in the X-ray signal by this mechanism. So we have to do everything right. But I guess that when we do, if we are able to do the self-consistent model, I guess that it will be possible to get the modulations that we need to explain the observations. But this is the final goal. So I'm going to stop here. Yes. Thank you.
Any more questions or discussion?
Yes.
So following Sanjay's question, the frequencies, if I understood that discussion correctly, the frequencies are ultimately set by the physics of the crust.
Not only, but it enters, yes.
Okay.
Very importantly.
So after this last piece of the talk, do you think that the frequencies will be modified substantially in the last section of the calculation where you actually have to produce photons and follow them? Or are you going to, you already said that some frequencies, the odd modes survive and the even modes do not. So that's already one kind of filter.
Yes.
From what you've seen so far with the photon, with the magnetosphere calculations, do you think that there may be other filters or changes in frequencies?
Okay, the change in frequency, I don't think so, because this is related directly to oscillations. There are another filter, which is where exactly is the surface moving. So you want it to be relatively high, close to the poles, because if you are very, very, very low, then the magnetic field that you are shaking, where you are creating the currents, is very close to the star. So you don't have the resonance of the. So you have to go far away, around hundreds of kilometers, to get the resonant cyclotron scattering, which will produce these modulations. So it's relatively high in the. This is another thing. Yes.
Then another possible diagnostic, which I don't think is as clean as the values of the frequency, the amplitude of various oscillations, right? And there, I imagine you would have to follow the rays as they come out of the.
Yes, yes, the amplitudes. I mean, it's something that we'll have to do to see. Yes.
Any other questions, comments? No, I gotta say, I mean, I'm really impressed that this has been moved to this level of sophistication. It took a while, but to actually start plowing away and trying to make sense of these, not only what's going on in the crust, but how it's coupled to the emitter. It's good. Maybe we'll learn something. Right? Let's thank Pablo again.